Hi everyone, it's Stacey here. Welcome to Quilt Club with Stacey Lee. Thank you so much for joining me for week 3 of our American Flags Quilt Along. This week we'll be attaching our borders and our sashing to our flags, finishing off our quilt tops, and this is always my favourite week because we really get to see what our quilts will look like. So let's get sewing. So for our sashing and borders we need to cut 16 3.5 inch strips, and then from those we need to then also cut 10 times 3.5 by 11 inch strips. So the first thing we'll do is cut 16 3.5 inch strips, and because I'm doing a lot of strips of the same size, I've put my painter's tape down here, which is just right next to the 3.5 inch mark, and it's just showing me that I want to cut right on the line after the masking tape. It's just a visual guide, it's not showing me exactly where I'll cut. So you all know the ropes now. I'm lining up a line on my ruler, lining up the line on my edge, and I already had a nice straight cut edge, and then I'll cut. So now we need to cut 10 3.5 by 11 inch strips to do our side sashing, but depending on how big your flags ended up will depend on how big this needs to be cut. So I'm going to cut mine at 11. You can choose to cut yours to whatever size your flag measured on the side, or you can cut them at 11 and square them off before we attach the next row of sashing. That's entirely up to you. But I'm going to cut mine at 11. So as usual, I'm going to cut off this rough edge here. So depending on how wide your fabric is, you'll probably need to use 3 to 4 strips that you've just cut. So please cut 10 11 inch strips, or whatever size you choose to cut yours at that match the size of your flags. So now we're going to join all our strips for our sashing that goes across the flags and for our borders, and I personally prefer any joins that are made that aren't part of the design to be done on the diagonal. So that's what I'll be doing. This is entirely up to you. You don't have to do this, but I do like to do diagonals, so I'm going to show you one more time how to do that. So I've got my first strip here and I'm using white. You might be using a patterned fabric, maybe a white polka dot. So you'd have the good side facing up, facing you. So that's the right side facing you. Then you take your next strip with the right side, if it was polka dots, facing down. So remember, we've got this lined up on a line so it's nice and straight. Then we're going to put it face down on another line on my mat, so we know that this one's straight and this one's straight, and the right sides are together, and then we're going to draw a line from the top left to the bottom right to show us where to sew. And then I just like to pop a pin on either side, making sure that there is room to come along with my sewing machine and sew down there. And then when we're happy, we turn that up and fold it over so it's going to be a continuous long length. And then we take this piece, line it up with a line, take our next piece, and it would be the right side of the fabric facing down again on a line coming down this way, remembering to keep our selvages right out of the way because we don't want them in our seams. And we do exactly the same thing. Draw a line where we're going to sew from the top left to the bottom right. Pin. Then we turn this over so it's a continuous strip, And then we carry on until we've joined all our strips. So now I'm at my sewing machine. I've done a quick test run to make sure my sewing machine is stitching nicely. I'm at stitch length 2, and I always stitch at stitch length 2 if it's anything to do with my quilt top. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew along all the lines that I drew as my guides on all of my joins. And we don't need to do back stitch because we will be coming over those edges again. And you can just open it up to check that you're happy with your join, and if you are, then find the next join you did and sew that and carry on until you've sewed all your joins together, please. So now we've finished sewing, we're going to cut off all the excess fabric here for all of our joins. So I'll take my ruler and I'm going to line up a line on my ruler at 1/4 inch on top of my sewing all the way along, and just trim that with my rotary cutter. And then the funny little triangles that are left, I'll just trim those off. And I'll do that for all of my joins. Okay, so now let's press all of our seams. So first I'll set them, and then I am going to open them up, and that's just a habit from always using it for the binding as well. You can do these to one side if you prefer. For me, it's just a habit to always press open when I am doing the diagonal join. So I'm finger pressing that, and then I'm going to press. And then if I haven't pressed out the manufacturer's fold, I will do that now. And then come along to every single join, set that seam and press it, please. So before we begin sewing our flags together, you do need to arrange them how you'd like them, and they need to be 3 across and 5 down. And then for each of my rows, I did put a number on them, just so I make sure I sew them in the right order. So here I've got my row 1, and I'm going to sew them together now with the smaller pieces that I cut, which were 3.5 inches by 11 inches. So I'll take my first piece, I'll take my top left corner flag, and I'm going to sew the sashing onto this side. So just like normal, I'll line up those edges and then I'll pin it. And now if you plan on cutting yours to the correct size as you go, I suggest always starting at the top and at least having the top perfect, and then we can square them off at the bottom. And I'm just going to turn this around because I want to sew on this side so that I can make sure all these seams are sitting correctly as I sew. So I will use a couple of pins, and you can use pins or not, that's entirely up to you. I'll just pop in a couple, making sure the edges are nicely lined up as well as my corners there. So I'll sew that first one together with my 1/4 inch foot on, and I'm just going to keep an eye on all these seams are sitting the correct way as I come up to them. And now I'm going to give that a quick press. So we'll just set the stitches, and then we're going to press them towards the white because there's too many seams coming the other way, so it's easier to set them towards the white. So I'll finger press that and give them a press. And then we'll sew on our next piece. So I'll take the piece that I just sewed on, and then I'll take my next flag and I'm going to sew that on to start making my first row. Make sure that your blue is up in the top left hand corner, And then I'll fold that over and I'll be sewing it along here. So I'll just line up those edges, making sure the corners line up, the edges along here, and I'll pop in a pin or two. And then I'll sew and press. So I just pressed that seam again to the white, and now I'll take another piece and sew it on to this side. Then I'll take my final flag and sew that on, and then I'll do that for all 5 rows. Okay, so now I've sewn my 3 flags together with the sashing in the middle. Now we need to cut our top border, bottom border, and the sashing between all the flags. So my table's a little bit small, so I'm just going to shimmy it across to the side here. I'm taking the strips, our 3.5 inch strips that we sewed together on the diagonal, and I'm going to place it on top in the center, using a seam in my sewing to make sure I'm lining it up straight. And I'm going to start just past the edge, and I'm going to lay it along the whole width of my sewn together pieces. So then I'll move that along, making sure it's nice and smooth and following a seam. And then when I come to the end here, I'm just going to trim it roughly with a pair of scissors, because we'll cut it properly with our cutter. We just need to grab our ruler and just cut that edge so it's running along the edge of our quilt, so we know that it's going to be the perfect size. So now I've done that side, and then I'll just move it back to where I started, making sure it's smoothed out, not taut, but it's not loose either. It's just sitting on there nicely. And then I'm going to cut on this side. If this makes you nervous, you can just spin it around and cut on the correct side, but it's just a little piece here, so I'm going to go for it. So we need to do that 6 times, because we need a top and a bottom and 4 for all the sashings. Okay, now we need to attach the 6 strips that we just cut, which make the top and the bottom borders and all the sashings running between our rows. So what we need to do is find the center, and because the blue square is off center, we can't use that as our guide. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fold this in half, line up those corners perfectly, and I'm just going to press here so I know that that is the center. Or you could measure it to find your center, but I think this is a slightly quicker way, and it's pretty accurate. And then what I'm going to do is take one of my strips and do exactly the same. I'm going to fold it in half perfectly, lining up those edges and the corners, finger pressing to get a line. And then what I'll do is I'll turn that around and I'll line up my finger press on my flag with the finger press on my sashing, and I know that's the center. When I've got them lined up, I'll pin it, and then I'll come to the edge here and I'm going to pin the corner, making sure all the edges are lined up nicely on this side and this side. And then I'll come to the other end and do the same, making sure all the edges are lined up nicely, and pin it. And then I'll come back and I'll just add in a few more pins. Okay, and now we'll sew it. Just before I start sewing, something I did forget to mention was when you are attaching your borders and your sashing, to make sure you're attaching it the right way. So if this was pattern fabric, my pattern would be here facing the right side of my flags, meaning that my seams that we did, the diagonal seams, are facing me. So when we open it up, it's all the right sides. So now I'm just going to sew that with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then I'll press. And I'll press again with the seams coming towards the white. Okay, so now I'm going to set the seams and press them, and I'll press them towards the white. And then what I would like you to do is to repeat that process until all your rows are sewn together, as well as your bottom border, and then repeat that process again for your side borders, and then we've finished our quilt top. Okay everyone, now we've finished our quilt tops, and please remember to share pics with me. I absolutely love seeing your progress and your beautiful quilts. A couple of things to remember is just to square off these 3 flags when you've sewn them together, so that when you attach your borders and your sashing, they'll sit really nicely. Also, give your whole quilt top a really nice press, making sure all the seams are sitting nicely. And lastly, just cut off all the loose threads, and that includes underneath, especially if they're showing through on the white. We don't want them showing through on your quilt when you're finished. Next week, we'll be basting and quilting, and I can't wait to see you then. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.